Squad depth is one of the most common terms in women's football coverage. When injuries pile up, when performance dips, when teams look tired, the explanation is usually simple. They just don't have enough depth. But what if most women's football teams don't lack ambition, coaching, or even planning, but are operating within a version of depth that looks good on paper and collapses under pressure? Because in women's football, squad depth is often talked about as though it's a given. In reality, is one of the most misunderstood concepts in the game. Now let's examine what people think squad depth is. When people talk about depth, they're usually talking about the numbers. 22 players, 2 options in every position, a bench that looks full. But real depth isn't just about how many players are registered. It's about how many players can start without a drop-off, how many can play multiple games in a short period of time, how many are trusted in high-pressure moments. And that is where the illusion begins. Because having players available is not the same thing as having players that are usable. Now let's explore the gap between available and trusted. Now one of the biggest hidden problems in women's football is the gap between availability and trust. On paper, squads look deep. In practice, many of the coaches rely on the same core group. Why is that? Because depth only works if players are match ready, systems are stable, and rotations don't fundamentally change how a team functions. In many teams, rotating 3 or 4 players doesn't just change personnel, it changes identity. So managers hesitate, minutes get concentrated, and depth becomes theoretical rather than functional. So why is rotation harder than it looks? Rotation sounds simple, but in women's football it's often constrained by reality. Smaller squads means fewer like-for-like replacements, more players playing out of position, and greater performance drop-offs. Add in shorter recovery windows, limited injury replacement options, and uneven investment across squads. And suddenly rotation isn't rest, it's actually risk. So when people say just rotate, they're actually ignoring how fragile balance actually is. Now let's talk about the injury depth feedback loop. This is where illusion becomes dangerous. Limited functional depth leads to overused core players, increased fatigue, and high injury risk. Injuries then further reduce the depth, which then increases the reliance on fewer players, which then raises injury risk again. It's a loop, and it's one that is rarely acknowledged in coverage. Instead, injuries are treated as unfortunate coincidences, rather than symptoms of structural strain. Depth didn't disappear, it just was never as real as it looked. So why is women's football especially vulnerable? Well, this isn't unique to women's football, but it's particularly amplified there. And that is because contracts are shorter, squad sizes are tighter, financial margins are thinner, and youth pipelines are uneven. Clubs can't always afford to carry players that may not contribute immediately. That means fewer development buffers, less room for adaptation, and less patience when performance dips. Depth becomes something teams aspire to, not something they can safely rely on. So how does this shape the narrative? Well, the illusion of depth doesn't just affect teams. It ultimately affects how we talk about them. When results drop, the blame often falls on coaching decisions, player mentality, and individual player errors, and very rarely on the structural reality, being that the squad was stretched beyond its limits, rotation wasn't viable, and options weren't interchangeable. Without honest discussion of depth, analysis becomes shallow, and that ultimately feeds frustrations for players, fans, and coaches alike. Now, what would a more honest conversation actually look like? A better conversation about squad depth would distinguish between player numbers and usability, acknowledge trade-offs in rotation, and accept uneven performances as structural, not personal. It would stop treating depth as a moral failing and start treating it as a resource that has limits. Because depth isn't about having more players. It's about having the conditions that allow for these players to be trusted. Squad depth in women's football isn't a simple problem with a simple fix. It's shaped by contracts, scheduling, finances, development, and expectations. And until we stop pretending that depth exists because the bench looks full, we will just keep misdiagnosing the same problems. Because the illusion of depth is comforting, but understanding its limits is what will actually move the game forward. Let me know your thoughts, and I will see you in the next video.